Welcome to Tom Rhodes Radio Smart Camp. Today's episode is about Lord Byron, the years of fame. Uh, let's just go over the life of Lord Byron, a little quick capsule review. Um, he went to university at Trinity College at Cambridge in England. He spent 3 years there engaging in sexual escapades, boxing, horse riding, and gambling. And it was while he was at Cambridge that he formed some of his best lifelong friendships, most notably with John Hobhouse. What a great name, Hobhouse. And Hobhouse initiated him into the Cambridge Whig Party, which endorsed liberal politics. Byron had every intention of going into a life of politics later in his life, but fame got in the way, and I think the criticism of his public speaking he didn't like. So after he went to Cambridge University, or Trinity College at Cambridge, he then went on this big journey to Greece and Turkey, which kind of changed his life. It set the romanticism of being an explorer, an adventurer, and that's where he started writing Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which was the work that catapulted him to fame in 1812. And 1812 was a really big year because that was the year that Napoleon was defeated. And Napoleon was hated in Europe, hated in England, but Lord Byron felt that Napoleon was the only man of his equal. He was Byron's hero, and he was actually the only person in Europe who was bummed out when Napoleon was defeated. 1812 was also the year that the waltz became the smash hit of Europe. And at the time, that was kind of like salsa dancing. For the old stuffy Victorians, they could touch and they could dance, and that led to fornication and all kinds of other happy evening activities. So he becomes the toast of the literary world in England. People can't buy his stuff up fast enough. People identify him with Childe Harold, the hero of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and he's kind of a cocksmith. He's screwing everything in sight, and he's addicted to opium. He's an alcoholic. He's partying. And he feels that if he gets married, that's going to kind of calm down his wild dog ways. So he marries this woman. I don't want to get too far ahead of the story, but he just thought being married was magically going to cure him of his wildness, which it didn't. And he was a really shitty husband. And let's just we'll save that part of the story. I'm going to be reading from two books today. The main one is Byron, The Years of Fame by Peter Quennell, which came out in 1935. But I want to read you a couple things from this 1974 book on Lord Byron by Peter Brent. And like I said, at Cambridge, he made some of his most important lifelong friends and connections, the people, John Murray, who would publish all of his works and poetry, and Hobhouse, who was his best friend. Skinner Matthews was one of his heroes and best friends at Cambridge. And then also, Byron fell in love with a young man named John Edelston, who sang in the choir at Trinity College. And Byron fell in love with him before he had even seen his face. He had heard his angelic voice. So this is interesting from the 1974 book, where they can, this author can speculate on Byron's homosexuality. Byron met and became passionately involved with a young choirster, John Edelston, whom he heard singing in the college chapel the first autumn he was in Cambridge. It was, Byron later said, a violent though pure love and passion. Yet it was certainly a love affair, the first of many such in Byron's life, not all of which were to remain, in the technical sense, pure. Now here's the speculation. If in the unknown layers of his psyche he hated women, it would not have been surprising. And from one point of view, his life can be taken as a long odyssey of revenge against them. The family configuration of a demanding mother and absent father is of course the classical one for the molding of a homosexual. Thus, a part of Byron's apparent greed for women may also have been rooted in the energy of his flight from men, may at times even have been a deliberate mask to deceive the world, another molded grimace, that of the indiscriminate but heterosexual lecher, behind which the more loving but homosexual aspect of the true Byron could be hid. Interesting. So Peter Brent is saying that his lecherous greed for women was basically a mask for his natural desire to be attracted to men. Interesting. So after Cambridge University, he goes on this big epic trip to Greece and Turkey with Hobhouse, and that's where he writes the first lines of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, when he's in the northwestern Greece city of Janina, which at the time was under the Ottoman Empire rule. The absolute ruler of Albania was a white-bearded tyrant named Ali Pasha, whose domains extended over Macedonia and western Greece. His capital was at Janina, and there Byron and Hobhouse arrived on October 5th to find that their quarters had already been prepared for them in what is now Byron Street. After two further visits to Ali Pasha, Byron returned to Janina, and there, on the last day of October, sat down to write the opening lines of his long poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And flipping through the pages for you. I love the descriptions of the way Byron dressed. He always dressed like a pimp. He had a club foot. He had to drag it. He wore a scarlet coat, richly embroidered with gold. His features were remarkably delicate and would have given him a feminine appearance but for the manly expression of his fine blue eyes. Taking off his feathered, cocked hat, he revealed curly auburn hair, which improved in no small degree the uncommon beauty of his face. So, not only is Ali Pasha, the ruler, attracted to Byron, so was Ali Pasha's son. And Byron didn't go for it, but there was a period where he's staying in this abbot with all these young boys, and he becomes attracted to his favorite, Niccolò Girard. And then when he gets back to England, he writes a will, and he actually leaves this Niccolò 7,000 pounds, which is a fortune at the time. And then he paid for Niccolò to go be educated in Malta. So, he was a cocksmith, but he was pretty generous to the people he was attracted to. And, this is interesting. The probable reason for this choice was his old favorite, Niccolò Girard, who was one of 6 pupils living in the monastery, in the care of the abbot. All 6 of the boys seemed to have romped in a distinctly flirtatious manner with Byron. He called them his sylphs, but it was Niccolò to whom he was especially drawn, needing to involve himself, perhaps, happy to feel love in an uncomplicated way. As Byron told Hobhouse, Niccolò had said that he would follow him across the world, and that they should not only live but die together. The latter I hope to avoid as much as the former he pleases. He was, he added, vastly happy and childish. Confirmed by another's affection, his existence and lovability thus certified, Byron was always happy, especially, perhaps, when the circumstances reproduced the easy, unrepeatable passions of his Harrow days. And Harrow was the rich kid boarding school he went to before Cambridge. The monastery must, for a while, have seemed like his old school, with Niccolò to play part of a Claire or a Long. I guess those are the guys he hooked up with. Okay, so that's the Lord Byron by Peter Brent. Now we're moving to Byron Years of Fame. Let's have a sip of coffee. Greece was the land of friendship, of adventure. All his life, it was to remain associated in Byron's mind with the idea of youth, that precious gift, which even at the age of 23 seemed to be slipping away from him like a prodigal's fortune. Greece implied the absence of responsibilities, indolent and yet ambitious, burdened with a very keen sense of the consideration that was due to a man of title and an ancient lineage, acutely apprehensive of the criticism to which life in the great world would expose him. He shrank from the prospect of existence in England. He did not pretend that he looked forward to seeing his mother, to whom his attitude, at the best of times, was frigidly dutiful. Now, when he returns from Greece and Turkey, his mother dies. His mother had, fucked with his head about his lameness, his lame foot, and she was, from a well-to-do family lineage, but she was uneducated and uncouth and embarrassed the shit out of him. And then also, Skinner Matthews dies when he comes back from this epic trip, and he drowned in the river by Cambridge by being tangled up in some underwater vines and stuff. So, now this is about his mother. Her rages had clouded his childhood by harping on his lameness. She had warped his character, her vulgarity, or royal descent. She was provincial to a core, had played havoc with his adolescent nerves, and yet, after all, she was part of himself. He said of her, "I owe her respect as a son, but I renounce her as a friend." Well, among Byron's intimates, he had occupied a privileged place. Was not Matthews an intellectual giant? To no other human being could he look up as once to this gay and delightful companion, whose character presented just that balance of qualities. For though he was a scholar, he was also a man of the world, and though a philosopher and skeptic, devoted like his friend to masculine sports. He boxed and swam valiantly, if not very well, which Byron found attractive and reassuring. Never was a man more obsessed by his memories. That was Byron. He just constantly was going over the events of his life and kind of sentimental. Moving with a slight limp, which he concealed or attempted to conceal by walking with a curious sliding swiftness. Skip over the Harrow stuff. Skinner Davies was left. No, that's Scrope Davies. Skinner Matthews. All right, let's move on. All around him was a deserted house. This is fucked up. All right, that's Newstead. So he had this big mansion that he inherits, Newstead Abbey, and when he got it, cows were grazing in the foyer of the house. He had these big empty rooms where he could box. Sounded like a lot of fun. I should have looked through this better before I recorded. Wearing a pink silk vest and cloak, white satin breeches and stockings, Spanish hat with a rich high plume of ostrich feathers, and numerous ornaments set with real diamonds made him a favorite butt of Regency audiences, who greeted his agonized posturings with roars of derisive glee. So everybody made fun of him. Kind of feminine. Now, this is the great thing. When he comes back from Greece and Turkey, he believes that he's going to go into politics. He thought his writings was just a hobby. And he wrote to his mother that he hopes to cure himself of the scourge, the disease of writing. And he didn't think he should take money for it until Childe Harold's pilgrimage starts making money, and then he changes his mind. But he's from Nottinghamshire, which is near Notting. It's the province or county where Nottingham is, and the Industrial Revolution is taking off in the north, and people are getting paid no money, and they want to strike. They want to get paid more money. So there's these frames where they're processing cotton and making clothes and fabrics and textiles. And people are rioting. They're not making enough money to live off of. They're starving to death. So they start smashing the frames. And what do the rich factory owners do in England? They come up with the death penalty for anybody who breaks one of these frames. So Byron goes in front of Parliament and he gives a speech defending the people that there shouldn't be the death penalty for just workers wanting a decent living wage. The riots against which this savage measure was principally directed had occurred in a part of England that Byron knew very well, and where he had been traveling only a few weeks earlier. It was in November that the unemployed stocking weavers of Nottingham had begun to destroy the new and wider frames that threatened to deprive them of their livelihood. Bands of rioters spread throughout the surrounding country. On November 14th, troops were called out, and before long, a small army of regular soldiers, 900 cavalry, and 1,000 infantry, was picketed in Nottingham. A display of force strengthened on January 8th by the arrival of 2 further regiments. The hand-loomed weavers and the revolt of the framework knitters in Nottinghamshire is mistakenly conceived if it is conceived as an uprising against machinery. The real conflict of the time is the struggle of these various classes, some working in the factories, some working in their homes, to maintain a standard of life. This struggle was not so much against machinery as against the power behind the machinery, the power of capital. By disposition and political preference, Byron was a liberal, and it angered him that the methods he had observed in use throughout the Turkish Empire should be directed against the inhabitants of an English town, and that the first care of the government should be to suppress evidences of misery rather than attempt to remedy its underlying cause. Well, nothing's changed. The pages are stuck together. The first edition of Childe Harold, 500 quarto copies, had been exhausted in the course of 3 days, sold out quickly. And almost every reader of the poem, certainly every feminine reader, aspired to meet the poet face to face. Wherever he went, his admirers surrounded him. They saw a small man, carefully but rather too elaborately dressed, who stood apart, often frowning, with a sharp contraction between his brows, the victim, as they imagined, of some mysterious secret sorrow. This melancholy was tempered by an air of underlying gentleness. His voice was musical and engaging, and although his movements were apt to be awkward and constrained, and now and then he seemed both shy and sulky. In some aspects, he had almost a feminine distinction. Byron was immoderately proud. We are told that he retired to bed in curl papers. That's to curl his hair. 5 feet 8 inches in full height. Privately, he chose to assume a further ½ inch, and since lameness obliged him to walk upon his toes, his compact and muscular body, developed by exercise, by the boxing, swimming, and fencing in which he satisfied his love of masculine sports, appeared a little taller than dimensions warranted. Lord Byron was merely a very handsome and exceedingly vain young man, but closer examination would have shown that while he spared no pains to present his beauty to the best advantage and was intensely conscious of the magnetism that it exerted, his self-love was more than counterbalanced by self-disgust. He hated himself. That Byron was lame, we know too well. But as the poet himself was incapable of discussing his lameness with restraint, lucidity, or resignation, and as Byron's attitude inevitably colored that of his friends, the entire subject is still enveloped in obscurity. It is difficult to gauge the extent of his lameness. Its origin and precise character have not yet been diagnosed. Loneliness was the background of his existence, and mere celebrity, much as he enjoyed it, could not satisfy the craving for affection and esteem, thwarted in childhood, sharpened by contrast, reminders of his physical shortcoming that was to haunt him at every stage of his career. Ebullient and talkative. Moore supposed that he was genuinely melancholy. Hobhouse suspected literary artifice. The dear fellow always relished mystification, and the big stupid public, as distinct from John Hobhouse, that rising politician and man of affairs, was only too ready to swallow the romantic bait. So the big stupid public was only too ready to swallow the big romantic bait of Childe Harold's pilgrimage. With the riots at home and wars abroad combined to produce an atmosphere of deep anxiety and restlessness, poverty was growing and wealth was accumulating. Squalid misery, such as Byron had observed in the industrial North, where towns had begun to spread over the country, each resembling some enormous murky stain, existed side by side with the rapid development of commerce and with the introduction of new luxuries and standards of living. The untrained laboring populace thickened and multiplied. Before dawn, the cobblestones of many blackened, narrow streets resounded to the clogs of innumerable children, who would not emerge from factory, mine, or sweatshop until dusk had once again descended, working some of them underground and in complete darkness for 12 or 14 hours. Laborers were still forbidden to join a union. The invention of the new machinery had upset the equilibrium and curtailed the livelihood of the earlier industrial classes. And throughout the year of 1812, frightful reports, rumors of discontent and civil disturbance continued to arrive from Lancashire and Yorkshire. The frame-breaking bill, which had reached the statute book, showed an apprehensive government attempting to regain and reinforce its hold. This is my favorite. Oh, listen to the Las Vegas police rolling by. Now, this is about Byron. I read this on stage in England. Neurotic and easily moved to tears, as when Brummel. Now, Beau Brummel is he's the man who started dandyism, who everybody admired. He was like such a well-dressed pimp guy. So, neurotic and easily moved to tears, as when Brummel had denounced the cut of his coat. He was inclined to escape from any difficult or unpleasant situation by retiring to bed, there to lie on his stomach and absorb soporific draughts of laudanum. Now, laudanum was this opium liquid type thing, and soporific is anything that makes you sleepy or drowsy. So he didn't like unpleasant situations, and he would run away from them by going to his room and sucking on opium. He never would have survived the Twitter age. What a little bitch. Go lie on his stomach and smoke laudanum. The extent of fashionable London was not large. Bond Street was the chief thoroughfare for shoppers and idlers, but London, then as now, was very far from being a democratic city. A privilege spent a great part of its life in resorts to which poverty and obscurity could not obtain an entrance, in private houses, in clubs and new hotels. Even a fellow romantic found him inscrutable. Let's skip that. Thus, Childe Harold had the fascination of an autobiography. In an age not yet sated with autobiographical revelations, the frankness with which the poet referred to his own youthful delinquencies struck a thrill of horror and delight through susceptible breasts. Romantic libertinism was not yet in vogue. Childe Harold was no cheerful voluptuary. He looked back on the memory of his sins with a cynical, saddened, embittered eye, but he did not repent of them, regarding them rather with a certain detachment not wholly devoid of literary self-esteem, since to break social bounds and infringe moral laws was the proper expression of fiery spirit. The responsibility for his offense belonged to his destiny, and that destiny was something he could not control. He believed he had this destiny to do something great, and that it was pulling him into this life and the path that he was on. The literary origins of Childe Harold must be discussed elsewhere, but the wicked lord, that ferocious and eccentric recluse, shunned by his neighbors, hated and feared by the surrounding peasantry, has not yet received his due. Childe Harold is a tribute to this gift of showmanship, absurd trumpery, affected, and yet, as in everything Byron did, the affectation is hard to distinguish from sincerity. In affectation, the writer seems often more sincere than when submitted to conventional standards. The year of Byron's apotheosis was the year of the waltz. Language can hardly exaggerate, says a contemporary, the folly that prevailed in 1812, year of calamity, distress, of social and political upheaval, year that saw the destruction of Napoleon, horribly prolonged across the frozen marches of Russia, and heard the waltz strike in London ballrooms for the first time. A dance that entailed the closest and most provocative physical contact, and was said to produce among its devotees a state of exhilaration highly dangerous alike to the virginity of debutantes and to the constancy of sober married women. Opinion in the fashionable world was sharply divided. So that was kind of like the waltz was like was kind of like salsa dancing of the time. People could touch, and they just went out of their mind for this. Waltzing, nevertheless, had become the rage in certain noble mansions, with unparalleled assiduity. I don't know what that word is. Assiduity. Yeah, sure. I don't think I'll edit that out, and now you know I'm a moron. And Byron hated the waltz because he had a lame foot, he had a club foot, and he couldn't do it. Now, a lot of women come into his orbit, older women, married women, and very important story is the story of Lady Caroline Lamb. She was married, and she lost her mind for Lord Byron. Caroline Lamb was to run a course even more passionate and impetuous than that of her mother, but in her composition, the ballast of good sense that had been inherited by Lady Bessingborough from the 18th century was replaced by hysterical bravado. Lady Bessborough might have dared everything for the sake of love. Lady Caroline would love and dare for the sake of daring. Lady Lamb was cynical and good-natured. Her voice rose to a scream at crowded dinner parties. Always must she lead the movement, plunge headlong into the latest craze, and when the waltz reached London from the Rhineland, Lady Caroline, dressed, or rather not dressed, so as to excite universal attention, she had her tits hanging out, and authorize every boldness of staring, was among the first to succumb to the spell of that giddy measure. It would seem that she was among the first to read Childe Harold. Instantly she decided that she would meet the poet, for she herself had written verses, and was the author of a rambling, unpublished story in which, against a wild romantic background, she had described the seduction of an infidel nobleman of an innocent girl. The poet, he warned her, had a club foot. Moreover, he bit his nails. She must see him. Lady Caroline persisted, but when, a few days later, at the house of Lady Westmoreland, whom Byron had met at Algeciras, she found herself being led by her hostess towards the ominous, attractive figure, and saw the other women throwing up their heads around him. She hesitated and abruptly turned aside. The poet had noticed her change of purpose. It is characteristic of human beings with Byron's mentality that one rebuff, a single failure to charm, outweighs a dozen triumphs. And from the center of an admiring and dazzling circle, he had seen Lady Caroline approach, had seen her hesitate, and decisively, dramatically turn away. So the fact that she turned away and gave up on him is what attracted him to her. The old playing hard to get trick. And Lady Caroline Lamb has got the most famous quote about him. After everything that she went through with Lord Byron, she said that he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Here has Lady Caroline. Do-do-doop-a-doop-boop. Lord Byron, you are a lucky man, said Rogers when she returned. Here has Lady Caroline been sitting in all her dirt with us, but as soon as you were announced, she fled to make herself beautiful. She saw herself as the happiest and gayest of human beings. Lord Byron had banished the musicians and dancers. He could not dance. Naturally puritanical, at least when it was a question of pleasures in which he was unable to take a direct and demonstrative share. Possessed, moreover, of a somewhat Mohammedan attitude, that's Muslim, towards the public exhibition of feminine beauty. He resented and ridiculed the new fashion. At his command, the morning waltzing parties were given up. He preferred solitude. He liked to read with me and stay with me out of the crowd. Not but what we went about together everywhere, and were at last invited as if we had been married. So he actually asked Lady Caroline to not do the waltz because he couldn't do it. And he was jealous of her out there with her titties out, dancing with other men. Rumor and legend are potent aphrodisiacs. Amen to that, brother. All his life, he abominated thin women. He hated thin women. When they were young, he said, they reminded him of dried-up butterflies, and when they had grown old, of spiders. And Lady Caroline was kind of skinny, so he made her feel shitty about herself. Had she been a famous beauty, she remarked elsewhere with the insight that is sometimes a reward of a deep and prolonged unhappiness, Byron might very well have loved her. Sexual snobism is often a byproduct of physical deformity. And snobism, the pleasures of sexual amour propre, little French word thrown in there, and of gratified social self-esteem had influenced his attitude from the very outset. Lady Caroline was young and of the first connections. She possessed an infinite vivacity of mind, an imagination heated by novel reading. I was soon congratulated by my friends on the conquest I had made, and did my utmost to show that I was not insensible to the partiality I could not but perceive. I made every effort to be in love, expressed as much ardor as I could muster, and kept feeding the flame with a constant supply of amatory verses. So he was romancing the shit out of her. In fact, he had sustained the comedy as long as he could. Byron was nothing if not plastic. For a man who complained bitterly, and not without reason, of the inconvenience to which he was subjected by turbulent and over-enthusiastic women, Byron showed an uncommon readiness to accept every adventure that came his way, although the last chapter of these romances he knew was customarily disastrous. So he went with most of the women who wanted him. Sexually, his character remains ambiguous. No man is so easily led as he is driven. You know, I hate women, he had reminded Hobhouse, and yet perhaps because his own nature included a decidedly feminine strain, he appreciated their company and conversation. He despised women, but he could not do without them. There is something to me very softening in the presence of a woman, some strange influence, even if one is not in love with them, which I cannot at all account for. Discussing any aspect of Byron's existence, we are at once brought face to face with a number of startling and perplexing contradictions. Everything about this guy was a contradiction. That Byron, still more the Byronic legend, possessed an extraordinary magnetic power we cannot doubt. But the man who attracts women is not necessarily attracted in turn, or he exploits his fascination from motives, opportunism, vanity, the wish to impress his fellow men that have nothing to do with desire and love. In his sexual life, as in many other things, Byron was an opportunist. Opportunity had made the rake. A rake was like a ladies' man. But if we assume that the typical rake exists, a human being dominated by the pursuit of the opposite sex, whose whole life is devoted to amatory carnage, whose greatest joy is the satisfaction of sexual inquisitiveness, Byron's temperament falls short of the requisite standard. It's kind of what I didn't like about this book, is that he makes declarations and then he forgives or wipes away. It's very ambiguous. He'll comment on certain Byron's traits and then he'll forgive it in the next sentence. He hated women because he hated and resented his mother. He pursued them because affection and admiration never came amiss, and because he himself was sufficiently feminine to find in their society, much as he despised, a strange influence that he could not at all account for. In every writer, says a French critic, there is a man and a woman. Genius is bisexual, and in Byron's nature, this division was strongly marked, and aggressive and to some extent factitious masculinity being counterbalanced by a softer, more susceptible and romantic self, which, though rarely seen, always quivered beneath the surface. It is the union of these two contrasted personalities that makes the essence of his character so hard to discern. Now, this book came out in 1935, and I picture Peter Quennell sitting in his book-lined study in England and having a couple of cognacs and then probably writing a little more than he should have about his opinion on Byron to be exerted. I have suggested that his nature included a pronounced strain of homosexual feeling, but as in so many bisexual temperaments, the emotion was curiously narcissistic. We love only ourselves, declares Paul Valery. In love, it is the self that we desire, the self that we long to encounter. And of Byron, it is certainly true that a passionate preoccupation with himself, a personage both loved and abominated, ran more deeply than any normal passion. He had expressly forbidden Lady Caroline to waltz. He was at least jealous enough to deny her a pleasure in which his lameness made it impossible for him to participate. Often the lovers quarreled. Coming home to his house in St. James Place, Samuel Rogers, an emaciated bachelor who lived only for society, for his bibelots, whatever that word is. Bibelots. Let's take a break and look this word up. Bibelots. Bibelots. Bibelots, a small household ornament or decorative object.
Bibelo.
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 Bibelo. Did you say bibelo?
Bibelo.
For his
Bibelo.
His caged nightingales and the pretty verses that he composed, they were all sentiment and sugar. Right? Well, he was restlessly thoughtful, his upper lip being drawn towards the nose with an expression of impatient disgust, shy, moody, and prone to sudden satirical outbursts. So he was moody. He kind of cocked his upper lip in this impatient disgust, like a lot of rich white douches of the period. And he was a smartass, prone to sudden satirical outbursts. So things turned kind of ugly with Lady Caroline. Nevertheless, he appreciated their society. He enjoyed conversation, the battle of wits, general argument, so long as it was carried on under the rules of good manners. Byron had taken a window for the execution. Oh yeah, this is fucking great. So in 1912 or 1812, also it was a big year. So he becomes famous. He's got some money, and the Prime Minister of England was assassinated. So he goes to the execution. They caught the man who assassinated the Prime Minister of England, and he goes to the execution with Hobhouse. And after they see this man executed, they're leaving, and Byron sees this homeless woman, and he goes to give her some money, a couple of shillings, and she smacks his hand, and the coins went flying in the air, and then she walked beside him for a block, mocking his club foot. And this guy, he had written a couple things, Hours of Idleness, was this book of poems he wrote, which was savaged by the critics, and they shit all over him. He if Brummel or somebody insulted the cut of his coat, he would have to go to his room and suck on liquid opium. He didn't like scenes. He didn't like any kind of uncomfortable situation. So this homeless woman, making fun of him and mocking him because he fancied himself as an aristocrat and a man of noble birth who looked down on large parts of society, even though he defended the working man in Parliament against being executed for breaking the frame looms. He must have had to suck on a lot of laudanum to get over this homeless woman making fun of him. So here we go. Let's read this. In his new circle of acquaintances, it will be noticed that the men of whom Byron spoke with most admiration were politicians, talkers, men of the world, men in whose life action predominated over introspection. I like that. Action over talk, baby. Men in whose life action predominated over introspection, who shone without the necessity of scribbling, for he still clung to his dream of public eminence. Meanwhile, pliable as ever, he followed the course that his destiny seemed to have laid down. Hobhouse was once more at his side. Tom Moore, an unfailing source of comfort, and, released from the constraint imposed by a crowd, the poet would gossip and chatter, with the bursting gaiety of a boy let loose from school. Nowadays, he and Moore had the same friends. Our visits, Moore writes, were mostly to the same places, and in the gay and giddy round of a London spring, we were generally, as in one of his own letters he expressed it, embarked in the same ship of fools together. The landscape of his old life had been left behind. Few young men at the age of 24 are able so thoroughly to change their entire existence, but the transformation might have been more effective had Byron's character not contained an element that it was almost impossible to change, since, try as he might, he could not jettison himself. The awareness of his fate perpetually persuaded him. Having admitted that he was morbidly superstitious, he must also admit that circumstances were continually conspiring to give his superstitions fresh color. Not the least extraordinary event of the year 1812 was the death of Spencer Perceval, the first English prime minister, to meet a fate that many English prime ministers have deserved. Shot down in the lobby of the House of Commons by Bellingham, a crazy timber merchant who had lost money at Archangel and fancied that he had a grievance against the Russian government and the British ambassador at Petersburg. Lady Bessborough's friend, Lord Granville Levinson Gower, Percival, was murdered on May 11th. A week later, Bellingham was hanged in front of Newgate Jail. Byron had taken a window for the execution. Like other abnormally sensitive men, he found in the spectacle of sudden death a certain horrid curiosity, a frigid and masochistic thrill that is sometimes reflected in the imagery of his verse. On this occasion, he was accompanied by two school friends, Bailey and John Maddox. After spending the night at a party, they arrived at Newgate at 3 o'clock. The house from which they were to watch the execution was still bolted and barred, and while Maddox did his best to rouse the inhabitants, Byron and Bailey walked arm in arm the deserted street. On a doorstep, Byron caught sight of a homeless woman. With an expression of sympathy, he bent down and offered her a few shillings. But instead of accepting them, the stranger thrust away his hand, tumbled to her feet with a wild scream of laughter, and hobbling alongside, began to mimic his awkward limping movements. Byron said nothing, and they moved off, leaving the beggar woman to her inexplicable and hideous parody. But as they rejoined Maddox, Bailey recorded, "I could feel his arm trembling within mine." Amazing. The homeless woman shrieking with laughter, mocking his club foot. Boy, that must have sent him into the toilet. Byron was a creature of moods, and unscrupulous and compunctious as his mood dictated. Easy to lead, he would not be driven. Affectionate when affection was not demanded of him. Magnanimous when he was not pressed for magnanimity. Until he was exasperated, he had no desire to wound. Peace and honor was the policy he would have preferred. Byron may or may not have thought it worth his while to answer these obscure... All right, fuck that. Let's move. We're moving on. I never saw so distressing a creature. Remorse was soon followed by threats, talk of suicide, by the declaration that she was with child, and that if she were obliged to leave London, she would certainly miscarry. Okay, Lady Caroline's back in the... Lady Caroline's behavior was also the subject of conversation in far more exalted circles. And the Prince Regent, meeting his old friend Lady Bessborough at a party, told her that Lord Melbourne had been with him very much out of humor, complaining that the young woman drove him distracted, and that we were almost as bad, that Lord Byron had bewitched the family, mothers and daughters and all, and that nothing would satisfy us but making a fool of him as well as ourselves. The prince delivered his tirade in a loud and excited voice, interrupting himself now and then to exclaim, "I never heard such a thing in my life," taking the mothers for their confidence. So Byron hated scenes, and Lady Caroline, she had made a few scenes in public, and her father, Lord Melbourne, had to send people to drag her out of London because she had made such an ass out of herself. Lady Caroline finally left London. She had promised not to see him again, to obey her mother, to do all that she could to make up for past faults. And by the first week in September, she had the satisfaction of knowing that she was safely established upon the opposite side of the Irish Channel, with her husband and Lady Bessaborough both in attendance. So they went to Ireland to get away from him. But she comes back. So he's famous now, and he starts, he dismisses Lady Caroline. He doesn't want anything to do with her. I don't know, her husband didn't have a problem with this. But he starts getting involved in the Drury Lane Theater. And then she told him that she had not been in love till she was 30. And I thought to myself, so with her, when she was 40, I never felt a stronger passion. Oh, this is Lady Oxford. This is this older woman. So he finally gets rid of Lady Caroline, and then he starts getting together with Lady Oxford, who was like, I think in her 50s, maybe her 60s. And he felt that if she was younger, she would have been the woman for him. She was funny. I never felt such a stronger passion, which she returned with equal ardor. I was as fond of, indeed more attracted than I ought to have been, to one who had bestowed her favors on many. But I was flattered at a preference that had led her to discord another, who in personal attractions and fashions was far my superior. Okay, so she had a bigger appetite than he did. Lady Caroline, for her dismissal, seemed the end of all things. In Ireland, her life had been one of irresponsible gaiety, alternating with sudden outbursts of rage and despair, and the new blow precipitated a crisis. Meanwhile, she had burnt her lover in effigy. She made an effigy of Byron and burnt it. During that year of 1806, a commission appointed to examine her conduct had acquainted her of the charge of having given birth to an illegitimate son. Oh, we're going to have to take a break. Okay, so it's important to emphasize the Lady Caroline Lamb story. Peter Quennell in this book kind of jumps around. He doesn't come out and say a lot of things. I'm going to jump back to this Peter Brent book right now and read you a few things. I love the names. Lady Caroline, Lady Oxford, Lady Milbanke. That's the woman he's going to marry. Annabella Milbanke. And then also in the Peter Quennell book, so he's got this story with Lady Caroline Lamb, and then he starts hanging out with this older woman, Lady Oxford, who he boned, and he appreciated her company and thought she was very intelligent and witty. And then also there's this this story. It's the most shattering story of his life, that while he was snowed in at Newstead Abbey, his house with his half-sister, Augusta, he had sex with her. And then he squirted inside of her like an animal, and they had a baby. So he didn't grow up with her, and she was his half-sister, but nonetheless, the man fucked his sister. And the Peter Quennell book doesn't really come out and say that. He kind of dances around it. So at the end of that book, he makes it clear when the scandal is costing Byron his career and his social standing in England. So let's jump back to the 1974 Peter Brent book. Lady Caroline Lamb had her own circle and was known for her almost eccentric unconcern for the opinions of others. And Byron, whose frozen-faced arrogance and vocabulary of sarcasm covered profound insecurities, may well have been nervous of her at first. Your ladyship, I am told, likes all that is new and rare for a moment, he said to her, offering her a rose and a carnation. It was hard for him to believe that she might be serious about him, for he was unused to dealing on level terms with the passions of his equals. Within a month of their meeting, however, they had become lovers, although Byron remained the wonder of society and the glory of the season. And among those who still, from a distance, followed his progress with a kind of condescending fascination was Annabella Milbanke. This is the woman he's going to marry later. Her curiosity, she had written to her mother in March, had been much gratified by seeing Lord Byron. It is said that he is an infidel, and I think it is probable from the general character of his mind. One can tell how her thoughts were already running from a diary entry of about this time, in which she set down her conviction that he is sincerely repentant for the evil he has done, though he has not the resolution, without aid, to adopt a new course of conduct. So he told her he's going to change, but he's still doing the same shit he wants to do. The self-realization of that without aid, imbued as it is with the feminine certainty that bad men are redeemable, if only they are given guidance, was to have sad consequences. Byron, a man concerned to heal his wounds with the affection of the world, though in the long run always on his own terms, may well have sensed her need to see him wavering on the bleak edge of redemption. And as Marchand puts it, he had an uncanny capacity for displaying that part of his personality which would most engage the person with whom he was talking. Now, this is back to Lady Caroline. The Peter Quennell book kind of says the same thing, but let's repeat it. The waltz had just come into fashion. Debarred from dancing it himself, he could not stand to see her dance it with others. He asked Caroline to give up the dance. She, who delighted in it, obeyed. Caroline said, I run and gallop and drive as if for a wager. She could do nothing slowly, nothing stealthily or deviously. She had never learned to care about the opinions of those about her. It was to be, in a sense, her tragedy, for when Byron, his volatile feelings burned out after 2 months, began to turn from her, she could not accept it. Indeed, in a sense, she never did accept it. So, Lady Caroline, there was some incident where she wouldn't leave London. She needed to be near him, and he had blown her off. She made a spectacle of herself, and then her father sent. She had to be dragged out of London, and the coach driver, the man who rode the carriage for the family, said to her, "Shame on you, Lady Caroline," because she was acting like a whore running around. But then she turned into a stalker, and then later she shows up at this party where Byron's at, and she pulled out some scissors, and she tried to cut her wrists. And somebody gets the scissors away from her, and then she breaks a glass. It was like a dessert little glass cup or something, and she tried to cut her wrists, and she's covered in blood. And that's when her family got her out of the country, and she went with her husband and lived in Ireland. And that's when she burned the effigy of Byron, trying to forget his clubfoot ass. Byron, with Hobhouse and his cousin and heir, Captain George Byron, traveled to Newstead for what Hobhouse called a delirium of sensuality. He met Lady Oxford, an older, subtler, perhaps more intelligent woman, soon to stand in Caroline's place, though it was a somewhat cooler place with her in it. Caroline, meanwhile, would not believe that the passion was over. She bombarded Byron with letters, appeared in the places and houses he did. As she wrote to him, self-aware but beyond self-help, I expose myself to every eye, to every unkind observation. She visited Byron, disguised, with under the disguise, one of her favorite page's outfits. She threatened to stab herself. Byron had to prevent her, and Hobhouse, who was there, finally took her to a friend's house. In early August, she sent him a present, tendrils of her pubic hair. Nice work, Caroline. I cut the hair too close and bled much more than you need. Do not you do the same. The gift had an inscription which began, Caroline Byron, next to Teresa, dearest and most faithful. Byron had used the name Teresa to disguise the sex and identity of Edelston in the poems he had written after the young man's death. It is likely, therefore, that Caroline knew of his love for Edelston, that was the choir boy back from Cambridge, and perhaps for other youths, especially since Byron's passion for Niccolo, still faithfully writing from Malta, had been his last before succumbing to Caroline. All right. I was and am yours freely and most entirely, to obey, to honor, love, and fly with you when, where, and how you yourself might and may determine. Byron's most extreme vice, perhaps, was his need to feel that he was feeling. He pressed emotions to appear, and when they did so, overindulged them. It is as if he were only properly alive when sentiment and sentimentality animated him. It is no wonder that poor Caroline, faced with the mixture of the lukewarm and the lava hot, should continue to believe he loved her. Okay, so then after fooling around with Lady Oxford, the Annabella Milbanke, who he marries, she had studied math, so his nickname for her was the Princess of Parallelograms. And you can look up parallelograms, just like I did. Okay, so we're going to jump back to the years of fame. Byron was not, nor granted the nature of his genius, could ever become a man primarily concerned with the welfare of his fellow human beings, a liberator driven by a sense of social injustice, or a doctrinaire politician impelled by theory. For Byron, there could be no escape from his destiny in the mass excitement of political life. Ambition had consumed him since his boyhood, but it was a passionately self-centered craving, and none of his previous achievements had brought him any real solace. So this is about his political career, and he really doesn't give a shit about other people. He really only cares about himself. So, and then when he spoke in front of Parliament, he had this kind of affected speaking style that he was trying to speak like an actor. There was one actor that he loved, I hope it pops up in this book, that he would go see perform. There was some boxing champion that he took boxing lessons with. There's a lot of really great small details. True, with the help of pen and ink, he could give vent to some of his dammed-up energy. But for the youth who had pictured himself as the scourge or savior of the realm, destined to write his name large in letters of blood and fire. This life that he was so condemned to lead, surrounded by hysterical women, importuned by admiring correspondents, a hero whose celebrity was due not to his rank, not to the distinction of his intellect, but to a fictitious personage with whom his credulous readers had chosen to identify him. So yeah, the character of Childe Harold in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, he's this melancholy, brooding adventurer traveling in Greece and Turkey, and he was worried about people confusing that character with himself, but that's exactly what they did. Doo-doo-boo. What he needed for his personal happiness was an equally perplexing problem. but it was plainly affection of a kind that had already been foreshadowed by the months of Olympian retirement passed with Lady Oxford. Some love that, although warm and sensuous, should not be exclusively sexual in its character, and should draw in its strength from its quasi-domestic origin. He had thought that he could be happy with a woman whom he respected, but whom he did not love. Lady Oxford had shown that the woman who made him happy might very well be older than himself, and combine the attractions of a mistress with the charm of a member of his own family, and that, besides arousing his passion, she might calm and comfort him. So, some people think that, he kind of was getting off on this mother figure when he was having sex with Lady Oxford. But, Lady Oxford giving him some pudding pops. So, as far as London was concerned, the Byron fever of 1812 showed signs of dying down. Okay, habitual gaiety, snobs and humiliations, supercilious manners. Just reading your highlights. They were reduced to states of inexhaustible laughter. To laugh with him was a sure road to his heart. Byron's requirements, like those of many overcomplicated characters, were, on the whole, extremely simple. He felt that he deserved, a family. And it was during June, soon after Lady Oxford's disappearance, that his half-sister, the only relation nearer than a cousin whom the fate that seemed to pursue all Byrons had left alive, came to join him from the country. Brother and sister had corresponded in 1811. An advance copy of Childe Harold had been dispatched to Augusta, that's his sister, in 1812. But afterwards some coldness had supervened. Well, they're gonna... here's some good words that we should learn. Let's look up bibulous. Ba-do-boo. To the Oxford Dictionary we go. Bib. Ulus. Highly absorbent.
Bibulous.
Did you say bibulous?
Bibulous.
Fond of alcoholic beverages. Marked by the consumption of alcoholic beverages.
Bibulous.
Okay. And then obstreperous.
Obstreperous.
Marked by unruly or aggressive noisiness.
Obstreperous. Obstreperous.
Stubbornly resistant to control.
Obstreperous.
Okay. She always enjoyed a joke at her own expense. This is Augusta. She always enjoyed a joke at her own expense. What a relief. Either way, she should help him prepare his racing correspondence, to find herself in London laughing with her brother at trifles of which they, and they alone, seemed to appreciate the comic point. Oh, Lady Caroline's response was to seize his hand and press some sharp instrument into the palm. I mean to use this, she whispered. Against me, I presume, Byron said, and turned to follow Lady Radcliffe, whom he was talking in to supper. Byron, she cried. Yeah, and then my hand got cut and blood came all over my gown. Yeah. At best, his character was a pattern of opposites. Indeed, there is scarcely a quality, moral or intellectual, to be discerned in Byron's makeup that cannot, at one time or another, be balanced by his exact antithesis. Thus, he was impetuous, but cautious, devoted to his friends, and yet, in many respects, an extremely untrustworthy intimate, soft-hearted, yet distinguished, now and then, by a streak of deliberate and cold-hearted cruelty, a lover of quiet, and yet a perpetual focus of storms. Generous and open-handed, yet, at all events, in his latter period, the damned close, calculating fellow, of whom his Italian acquaintances often complained. Puritanical but promiscuous, a person of rare common sense, a man of the world blessed with a skeptical and disbelieving irony, and yet the prey of superstitions without end. He was the romantic wanderer. Maybe that's why I like him. When what he most desired was the quietude of private life. During July 1813, an event occurred that changed the whole course of Byron's life. It was an event that those whom it concerned did their best to envelop in the deepest secrecy, though Byron could not forbear hinting, both in his correspondence and in the diary he afterwards wrote, that a secret there was, that it tormented him, that it was seldom out of his thoughts, but that there were weighty and terrible reasons why it could never be unfolded. There seems nowadays little doubt that the secret concerned his relationship with Augusta Lee. Miss Lee, that was his sister, and he had sex with her. Squirted inside of her like an animal? Who fucking does that? Again, one remembers his Calvinist upbringing. Doomed at birth, the wicked are as powerless to escape damnation as is the hero of classical tragedy to free himself from the mechanism of fate. It was not good, believed the ancients, that a man should exist on a more grandiloquent emotional plane than the majority of his fellows. Perils surround a man who leaves the herd. A single misstep, a moment of thoughtless arrogance, of impious curiosity, and the fact of hubris has been committed, from which infatuation, must soon result. Caught up in the consequences of an impious gesture, the hero moves on rapidly to his predestined fall. Levity prepares the way for tragedy. Augusta, in spite of her training, was amoral. Byron, in spite of his anecdotes and his immoralist acquainted with the sense of sin. Had Byron been an unreflecting pagan, it is possible that the act that caused so much misery might never have been precipitated, for then it would have lost the charm of the unlawful, or if precipitated, that the havoc it caused would have been relatively slight. Byron, however, was an immoralist, a man who sins with a consciousness of wrongdoing, and sins again because the sense of guilt demands always fresh fuel. Wow. I always thought that Catholic guilt intensified the pleasure. Once launched on the painful process of self-discovery, regardless of suffering, it was his destiny to work it out. Byron must be defended because incest is disgraceful, abhorrent, flagitious. Flagitious.
Flagitious.
Marked by scandalous crime or vice.
Flagitious.
Great word, flagitious.
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 That's what I said.
Flagitious.
Yet the same commentators accept the irregularity of Byron's life in London and the squalid and discontented debauchery of his career in Venice, with an understanding smile or shrug. It's kind of the conversation everybody's having these days about, do you separate the artist from the art? Because it's kind of hard to get over this pretty fucked up thing that he did. He had announced that he was going abroad with his sister. It was a wild scheme. Well, he never did that. Anyway, so After a dinner, among bottles of red and white champagne, Burgundy, 2 sorts of claret, and lighter vintages, the gentleman sat up late, and on one occasion Byron, imprudent enough to drain his silver-mounted skull cup, which held rather more than one bottle, at a single draught, with the result that he was obliged to retire to bed, where he was first convulsed and presently lost consciousness. The dude had a silver-plated skull mug. Did you dig that? Guys drinking fucking wine from a silver-plated skull mug. Now, that's pretty pimp. Byron replied that he had always had a presentiment that his life would be attacked, and this fear induced him to travel fully armed. Oh yeah, the guy loved guns. He always had guns on him, and he always slept with guns beside his bed. If this had begun 10 years ago, boop. When one subtracts from life infancy, sleep, eating, and swilling, buttoning and unbuttoning, how much remains of downright existence? So he's partying like crazy, and he feels that, like his father's wife died young, and then he remarried a woman that had money, and then his grandfather had done the same thing. I think there was something in this family lineage where they thought that you could marry into wealth, and that would solve all of your problems. Byron also felt that by marrying Annabella Milbanke, I guess he kind of respected her, but she had money, and he felt that the respectability of marriage would somehow cure him of the lecherous, night-prowling, scoundrel qualities that he had. Reading his journal with its plentiful sprinkling of asterisks, we perceive that although Lady Frances accounts for some of, and Augusta Lee, no doubt for others, whole tracts of his experience remain obscure. Apparently he had written his life story, and he left it to his friends, and where he told everything about all the women that he screwed and the wild things that he did, and they didn't want people's reputations to be smeared for history, so they had a party and they burned it all. No reader was so obscure that he or she did not feel qualified to write to Byron, and after some prefatory apologies mentioning that the correspondent had not the honor of his lordship's acquaintance to sympathize, admonish, or extol, some set forth their problems at great length. Byron was the first English writer whose personal life, opinions, and alleged private habits evoked a degree of curiosity now reserved for film actors, popular musicians, famous athletes, and other heroes of the popular daily press. He was one of the earliest victims of the modern technique of publicity, but it must be conceded that although the poet often boggled at the part he was obliged to play, his presentation revealed an instinctive grasp of showmanship. The gifts he had shown in his private legend-making soon extended to the conduct of his public career. So everybody's writing him letters. He's like the star of England. He set dreams and passions, and obviously women are clipping their pubic hair and sending it to the guy. So this is a letter that he got from some fan. My dear Lord Byron, I am a poor country girl that has not the happiness of knowing you. I am afraid you will think me very impertinent in writing to you without the slightest claim in the world to your attention. But I admire you so very, very much that you must excuse this madness. I cannot help thinking that you have much feeling. You can now make one happy. Oh, I speak from my heart when I say nothing could give me more joy on earth than a lock of your hair. Please let me have it, I entreat you, by all you ever loved. And then when you see somebody In ecstasies, think of your eternally devoted Sophia Louisa MacDonald. If you feel a great deal of contempt, my dearest Lord Byron, pray tear this, but do not show it anyone. Pray forgive my folly, but give me the lock. A week later, the lock had not arrived, and Miss MacDonald thereupon wrote a second epistle, couched in a strain even more pathetic and despairing than the first. My dearest Lord Byron, your picture does not look very cruel, but I am afraid the talisman by which you fascinate the hearts of others charms away all sensibility from your own. I have set my heart on but one lock. Do not be inexorable, Lord Byron, for the world says you will soon be married, and then I dare not ask you. Excuse this letter. It is desperate, but I am obliged to write on the down. All these correspondents had fallen victim to the same spell, a magnetism that seems the more extraordinary when we remember that it was radiated by a very young man whose celebrity, at the time most of these letters were composed, was barely 2 years old, whose finest work, he had only been famous for 2 years, and whose finest work was not yet in contemplation. For his personality, rather than his verse, contained his secret. Unpolished, carelessly constructed, his poems presented, nevertheless, some reflection of the strength of his personality, as distinct from strength or intellect or will, that gave his life its heroic or demonic coloring. The hero might be prosaic, the demon an opportunist, but then demons, good or bad, are exceedingly rare. Playing the devil with all kinds of vulgar mistresses. Indoors gaiety and good humor prevailed. When my sister, who has always had more influence over me than anyone else, persuaded me not to do it, for she said, if you go, you will fall in love again, and there will be a scene. One step will lead to another. It was fortunate that Hobhouse should have returned to London. Rushing upstairs, he joined my dearest Byron. Many were the days since he had been so happy, and from Drury Lane they drove home to Bennett Street and sat up talking until 4 o'clock. Byron himself was equally delighted. Hobhouse was his best friend. He declared the most lively and a man of the most sterling talents extent, and again, when Hobhouse had regaled him with the 10,000 anecdotes of Napoleon, all good and true, his friend Hobhouse was the most entertaining of companions, and a fine fellow to boot. Henceforth, Byron and Hobhouse were much together. Hobhouse dined with Byron at Cocoa Tree, spent an entire evening listening to his confessions, and grumbled that during his absence, Byron had become more and more unsociable. So he's got all this fame, so now he starts working at Drury Lane Theater. He gets married to Annabella Milbanke, and he treats her like shit. He's addicted to opium, he's drinking too much, and he's hanging around the theater, and he's screwing actresses. And there was one actress that had fallen in love with him like all these other women, and he was such an arrogant prick. He, after he had had his way with her, he kind of ignored her. And as you can imagine, that pissed her off. A solitary hobgoblin. That's what he became. Both friends had a passion for the theater. On February 19th, they saw Keene. Keene's that actor that he loved. Him and Hobhouse loved this dude. Great, this must be it. On February 19th, they saw Keene in Richard III, and on March 12th, the same actor in Hamlet. When Hamlet fell, the pit rose to its feet, and a tempest of emotion surged through the whole house. As Richard, Keene was even more successful. A small man with a piercing black eye, he gave to the character a sportive ferocity that electrified his audience, while his speech to Stanley What do they in the North? What do they in the North? Was delivered in a loud and shrill, taunting interrogatory that produced an extraordinary effect. His scene with Lady Anne was highly finished. Later, it was during May, Byron, Hobhouse, and Tom Moore watched Kean and Othello. For 2 acts and a half, reported Hobhouse, the play was tame. But from the sentence, "not a jot," he displayed his extraordinary powers, and as Byron said, threw a sort of Levant fury of expression into his actions and face, to which we Orientalists had been accustomed, and which we could appreciate. His stabbing himself was a masterpiece. What a fucking great sentence. His stabbing himself was a masterpiece. "By Jove," commented Byron, returning home after his first glimpse of Kean and Richard, "he is a soul, life, nature, truth, without exaggeration or diminution. Energy, whether it was displayed in the burly person of Tom Cribb or in the short dynamic figure of Edmund Kean, never failed to kindle his respect. The more lethargic he himself became, the greater was the admiration that he felt for men whose courage and enterprise enabled them to confront the difficulties of an active career." So he's brooding over the happenings of his heroic Napoleon, who was retreating inch by inch. On April 12th, Hobhouse noted in his diary that Byron goes not to Paris, and on April 15th, at Newmarket, Augusta Lee was delivered of a child, Elizabeth Medora Lee, a young girl destined to run through many vicissitudes, cause great scandal and endure much unhappiness before she eventually expired in poverty and obscurity in the year 1849. Wow. Poor girl. Colonel Lee was away in Yorkshire when she was born. That was her. Yes, his sister was married when he fucked her, by the way, to a colonel. Byron informed Lady Melbourne that it was not an ape. They were worried back then that incest babies might be born apes. A reference presumably to the medieval superstition that children of incest were born monsters. And if it is, that must be my fault. However, I will positively reform. You must, however, allow that it is utterly impossible that I can ever be half as well liked elsewhere, and I have been all my life trying to make someone love me, and never got the sort that I preferred before. So, fresh hints of incest troubled Lady Melbourne. There are exceptional human beings in whose lives the instinct of self-destruction outweighs the instinct of self-preservation. Individuals who feel the need to suffer just as acutely as they imagine that they feel the need to enjoy, who constitute themselves the patient architects of their own ruin. In this context, one thinks of Oscar Wilde. For, like Byron, Wilde was a gifted and intelligent man who courted disaster as though disaster would bring fulfillment of some need that might otherwise never find expression. Like Byron, Wilde showed a streak of arrogance, but whereas Wilde's nature was shallow and sparkling, witnessed the almost complete collapse that overtook his latter years, at his most cynical, Byron's nature had a sluggish intensity. If he drifted, as all his youth he had been glad to do, it was in obedience to strong currents running deep beneath the surface. That doesn't mean he can fuck his sister. An unaccountable figure to stand at the heat of a literary movement, yet Romanticism was to become identified with Byronism, And Byronism may be defined as a personal presentation, to some extent, a vulgarization of a movement that Byron himself scarcely understood, that had embodied itself in his personality very largely against his will, and certainly round counter to most of his tastes. But there was no escaping his enormous popularity. Despite the journalistic hubbub caused by stanzas to a lady weeping, The Corsair was more successful than any poem he had so far produced. On the day of publication alone, it had sold 10,000 copies, a thing perfectly unprecedented. And 30 purchasers, reported Mr. Murray, had returned to tell the people in the shop how much they had been delighted and satisfied. While Moore, to whom the poem had been dedicated, wrote that he heard that it was liked beyond measure. It was liked beyond measure. I may perhaps, as godfather, be suspected of undue partiality for the child, but anything more fearfully interesting, more wild, touching, and negligently grand, I never read from your pen. You are careless, but you can afford to be so. Whenever you slumber, it is like the albatross, high in the air and on the wing. His conception of the poet's role was very simple. Poetry was a recurrent fever and a flatus. Let's take a look. Afflatus. Afflatus, a divine imparting of knowledge or power. Oh, fuck, I should know that word.
Afflatus.
A divine imparting of knowledge or power.
Afflatus.
Did you say afflatus?
Afflatus.
You did say.
Afflatus.
I like that word. His conception of the poet's role was very simple. Poetry was a recurrent fever, an afflatus. In certain circumstances, usually during the aftermath of some more than commonly exacting passion, it bit you. The poet gave way, and the result was a torrent of unbridled verse. Pour that shit out, Byron. A poet whose poems were a projection of the personal legend he had been spinning since boyhood. Byron's view of poetry and of his own function as a poet was very similar to that of his enormous middle-class public. Seen through their eyes, he was a poet par excellence. Divine frenzy, dark moods. Not a single detail had been omitted from the portrait. He was a poet, and he belonged to a life apart. Poetry was an incalculable and enigmatic gift, not a normal function of the civilized human mind. The cult of the exotic did not begin with Byron, but the popularity of Byron's verse gave it a more powerful impetus. Balzac, who wore out his health preparing a romantic background worthy of one of his own novels, even Baudelaire, whose early dandyism soon exhausted his small inherited fortune. The decline of taste and the spread of romanticism went hand in hand. And in the rooms of many a young romantic, with their Renaissance curtained alcoves, inlaid tables, Turkish weapons and pipes, and exotic plants, Byron's features glimmered down from a lofty pedestal. People had his picture up in their houses. To write a study of Byronism would be to survey the entire field of romantic poetry, music, and painting. As far afield as Russia, and as late as the close of the 19th century, Byron's spirit continued to range abroad. It haunts the pictures of Delacroix, the music and the life of Berlioz, the verses of Hugo. Boo-dee-boo. All right. Romantic nationalism destroyed much that was of value and precipitated many disasters. Hey, we're living that sentence now. Romantic nationalism destroyed much that was of value and precipitated many disasters. So, Lady Caroline admits her passion, admits the scene at Lady Heathrow's ball after burning Byron in effigy. She had visited his rooms. All right, fuck Lady Caroline. We've had enough of this bitch. Sorry, I didn't mean to use the words bitch. Yet his indiscretion may have had practical motive. Possibly it interested him to put Lady Caroline's loudly expressed devotion to the supreme proof of entrusting her with a secret that has puzzled and disturbed 2 generations of critics and commentators. But it is also possible that by divulging the real passion of his life and breathing the dear sacred name that even in his letters to Lady Melbourne is usually concealed behind an initial, a cross, or a significant pseudonym. So he was referring to his sister. I guess he told Lady Caroline. And that's the thing. When he was drunk with his wife, he told his wife. His wife is one of the few heroes of the story because 1 year into their marriage, she says, fuck this, and she leaves the dude. They had a kid. He takes the kid. She takes the kid and leaves him. And people didn't leave their marriages or their husbands back then. And then her and her mother spread the very true rumor that he had not only fucked his sister, that he had a kid with her. And then that was the big scandal that he was driven out of London society. There was a big party where all the best people of London society was at, and they all purposefully snubbed him and walked out of the room when he walked in. And that's when he knew his shit stank and that he wasn't welcomed in London anymore. That's when he decides to move to Italy after his life falls apart. So we're now on page 189 of The Years of Fame by Peter Quennell. Nearing the end, ladies and gentlemen. I did, do, and always shall love you. It was a challenge both to Annabella and to his own destiny. There comes a moment in the drama of human affairs when, having passed the rapids, the stream rushes smooth, swift, and almost noiseless towards the shelf that hides the falls. Money at the time was unusually plentiful. Claughton had forfeited his deposit of £25,000. That's it. He needs money. He's trying to sell Newstead Abbey. He can't do anything with it. It had been this ongoing headache and cause of stress for him. He couldn't pay for the upkeep of the house, and then he's living all fancy. He changes his mind about that he shouldn't take money for his own writings, and now he's got a little money coming in, and then finally, the guy who was going to buy Newstead Abbey defaulted on the deposit, so he got to keep the money, and then shortly after his life is falling apart, he manages to sell Newstead Abbey, and he's got enough money to flee the country. Little did Byron suspect the relief and exhilaration with which Miss Milbanke had received his second offer of marriage. Okay, I got a little ahead of the story. They're not even married yet, and I already told you what happens. He was at Newstead, that melancholy and dilapidated building, already the witness to so many momentous and poignant scenes. Newstead, theater of the cruelties, extravagances, and follies, perpetuated by his dim ancestral prototype, the wicked lord. That was his great uncle. Newstead, where he had quarreled with Lord Grey de Ruthen, where his mother had died, where Lady Frances had confessed her love, but had not fallen, where he had been snowbound a memorable week with Augusta Lee. Yeah, that was a memorable week, squirting inside of her like an animal. Here the doom that pursued the Byrons was omnipresent, in the naked skyline stripped of its oak trees by the wicked lord, in every stone of the abbey underfoot, in the very soil on which he trode. And now, as he awaited a reply from Annabella, a gardener came to him with a ring that he had dug up in a flower bed. It was his mother's wedding ring, lost many years before, and Byron decided that if her reply were favorable, with this, this very ring he would himself be married. He was at dinner when Miss Milbank's acceptance arrived. Save for Augusta, the apothecary, gotta look up one more word. Apothecary. Are you learning with me? Apothecary, one who prepares and sells drugs or compounds for medicinal purposes.
Apothecary.
Apothecary,
Apothecary.
one who prepares and sells drugs or compounds for medicinal purposes.
Apothecary.
I wonder if the pot growers of California are.
Apothecary.
Where is that word? Apothecary. Save for Augusta and the apothecary who had his charge of his health, he was alone. Oh, okay, so his sister and his drug dealer are the only ones he had. Byron broke the seal and read the letter, then handed it across the table to his sister Augusta Lee. It never rains, but it pours, he observed wryly, looking so pale that she thought he was about to faint. Yeah, so he kind of looked at marriage as like this death sentence, and he wasn't happy about it at all. To Lady Melbourne, London Diary. At noon, there was still no sign of the London dandy. Okay. Byron's conduct was often peculiar. There were times when he was as winning and gentle as she could have desired. Of his sister, he talked tenderly and at length. But while he explained that Augusta treated him as if he were a child, and that Annabella reminded him of Miss Lee, when you are playful, that's kind of creepy, telling his wife that she reminds him of his sister, he added that no one else would ever possess so much of his love as the other, the love he had for Augusta, and Annabella felt a pang of jealous grief. So he's fucking with his wife's head. So not only is he a shitty husband and staying out and doing whatever he pleases, he's fucking with his wife's head by saying that he'll never love anyone as much as he loves his sister. And that, when she's playful, she reminds, I guess, okay, you get that. I can never get over that, Annabella said. Annabella, who found the conflict of passion and common sense too much for her nerves, would appear to have suggested that it should be curtailed. From her point of view, his visit, so eagerly anticipated, so often and so unaccountably postponed, had been full of doubt. Yeah, he kept putting off the wedding. Anguish and perplexity, but these emotions she did not divulge to her mother and father. They, at all events, had been captivated by their future son-in-law. Around them he had woven that insidious and almost feminine charm which was one of his greatest gifts. Listening, confabulating, laughing at jokes, until even the family solicitor had succumbed to his magnetism. He liked women whose love was sensual and spontaneous, who laid no claims, made no demands. Through the carriage window, Byron had grasped his hand, and even when the carriage had begun to move, oh yeah, Hobhouse is leaving, and he didn't want Hobhouse to leave him because he's married. And then he just becomes an absolute cock to her. It must come to a separation, he declared a little later. She should have accepted his original offer. Oh, so he originally offered to marry her and she declined, and then he held that against her. For in the meantime, something had happened of which the effects could never be repaired. It was her fault. He would be even with her. He would be even with her. She would find that she had married a devil. His attitude was violent, almost frenzied. But soon his mood changed. He laughed when he noticed that she seemed hurt. He fucking laughed at her when she was hurt. Guy was a cock. Bade her no attention to what she said and concluded by expressing every feeling of tenderness, so that the miserable comedy went out. He might comfort her, but soon the pressure of his own secret emotions was too much for him, and he mused aloud as to how long he would be able to sustain the part he had been playing in the insinuated that he and her aunt were fellow conspirators. Annabella, the spoiled child, was now in his power, and he promised gloomily, "I shall make you feel it." Yeah, what a dick. According to his friends, who were privileged to read his memoirs, Byron claimed that he had consummated his marriage on a sofa before going in to dine. After dinner, remembered Lady Byron, that's what Annabella Milbanke is now called, Lady Byron, the bridegroom explained that he hated sleeping in the same bed with any woman, but she might share his bed if she chose, and added that, provided she was young, one woman was as satisfying as another. They spent their wedding night in a large bed with red damask curtains. The light of the fire and the solitary taper glimmered through, for Byron was always fearful of the darkness. And in that wavering, ruddy illumination, she heard him wake up and cry furious in anguish, "Good God, I am surely in hell!" That's what he wakes up on his wedding night and says, "Good God, I'm surely in hell." And then apparently he fucked her on the sofa before the wedding dinner. So, well, if the guy got a boner, he needed to attend to it. He repeated his assertion that between his first and second proposal, something had happened that he could never get over. He was a villain to have married her. He could convince her of it in 3 words, yet if she had married him 2 years ago, she might have saved him. Okay, so now he's blaming her for the fact that he fucked his own sister. What a creep. "I only want a woman to laugh," he announced, "and don't care what she is besides. I can make Augusta laugh at anything. No one makes me happy but Augusta." Annabella, it was true, could not make him laugh. She had grasped the fact that his lameness was responsible for much of his eccentricity, and persuaded him to talk of it without reserve. All right, so you're getting the idea here. "Now I have her, you will find I can do without you." Both Annabella and Augusta were Byron's victims, and not the least misery of those tormented weeks was the spectacle of Byron's daily wretchedness. For the sufferings he inflicted sprang from his own. Through them he punished himself. In the humiliations to which he subjected the 2 women, he committed the final and most excruciating assault against his own moral nature. His sense of delinquency was overpowering, and as the passion of remorse increased, so did it demand fresh material. Thus Byron had presented her with one of the 2 golden brooches containing his hair and hers, with 3 crosses on them, and he amused himself by drawing attention to these ornaments and reminding Augusta of the signs by which they had communicated while they were snowbound at Newstead. He observed on a later occasion, "That is my child," and set out to support his assertion by explaining how long Colonel Lee had been away from home at the time Medora was conceived. There were nights when he seemed to regard her with physical aversion, when in her sleep she moved towards him, and he awoke her with the words delivered in tones of raging detestation, "Don't touch me!" And there were times when she heard the freezing sound of heartless professions, more intolerable than his uncontrolled abhorrence. So he acted disgusted by the very touch of his wife, and he heartlessly told her that he fucked his sister and made a baby. The Byrons had arrived at Piccadilly Terrace at the end of March, and only a week later Miss Lee, the sister, apparently at her sister-in-law's request, came up to join them from the country. In the whole situation, perhaps in the whole history of Byron's life, nothing is more extraordinary than Annabella's attitude towards the woman whom she had learned to regard as a dangerous, though an involuntary, rival. It is on this attitude that Lady Byron's detractors are inclined to found a large part of their case. It is credible, they demand, that if Annabella had had real cause to suspect Byron and Augusta of an incestuous relationship, she would have written to Mrs. Lee in the warmest terms and encouraged her to visit the London house. Why would she have written her? The fact remains that even after Lady Byron, at her lawyer's insistence, had recorded her suspicions, together with her reasons for continuing to receive Miss Lee, her behavior was as affectionate or almost as affectionate as in the past. Certainly such behavior is very strange, but then, so was the situation. So were the three passionate and ill-starred personalities whom it involved. Lady Byron, her biographer has pointed out, was always prone to romantic attachments for other women, and Augusta had a great deal of Byronic charm. At her house, Augusta's kindness had been unforgettable. She stood alone between Annabella and Byron's fury. Both women suffered from his moods, and both agreed that the late hours and convivial committee meetings which accompanied his business at the theater had a disastrous effect upon his health and nerves. Yeah, so he's at the theater all the time. He's fucking doing opium, drinking out of his silver-plated skull. All right, we are nearing. Like other parties, it was first silent, then talky, then argumentative, then disputations, then unintelligible, then altogethery. That's the way he wrote it, altogethery. Then inarticulate, then drunk. When he had reached the last step of this glorious ladder, it was difficult to get down again without stumbling. My lord, my lord, he exclaimed breathlessly, a great battle has been fought in the Low Countries, and Bonaparte is entirely defeated. But is it true? Demanded Byron. It is true. Yes, my lord, it is certainly true. An aide-de-camp arrived in town last night and has been in Downing Street. He says he thinks Bonaparte is in full retreat towards Paris. I am damned sorry for it, Byron replied. I didn't know, he added after a pause, but I might live to see Lord Castlereagh's head on a pole, but I supposed I shan't now. Yeah, he was the only one upset that Napoleon was defeated. His emotion on hearing the news of Waterloo soon gave way to a disgusted acquiescence in the old system. He was sick at heart of politics and slaughters, and the luck which Providence is pleased to lavish upon Lord Castlereagh is only a proof of the little value the gods set upon prosperity, when they permit such bullshit as he and that drunken corporal, old Blucher, to bully their betters. Once again he had determined to make life an amusement, but now his amusements had a coloring of desperation. He grew day by day more nervous, abrupt, and odd. He had always been prone to violent and impulsive gestures, and when Annabella remarked, thinking to amuse him, that the parrot had bitten her foot, he seized the bird and cage and hurled them out the window. Fuck. This guy's an asshole. He had many opportunities of desultory lovemaking. Desultory. how we read and look shit up.
Desultory.
Desultory, marked by lack of definite plan, regularity, or purpose. A dragged-out ordeal, not connected with the main subject. Disappointing in progress, performance, or quality. Marked by lack of definite plan, regularity, or purpose.
Desultory.
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 He had many opportunities of desultory lovemaking, and a curious little episode of amorous spite and a professional jealousy is revealed by 2 letters from Miss Boyce, a young actress with whom Rogers remembered having once found the poet closeted in a dark corner of his private box. So this is a letter she wrote him. My lord, I fear I shall have cause to lament the last hour of my existence, your conduct to me, since it has not been uniform. In the first instance, you paid so much attention to me in the theater. At a time I was respected and loved by all. You caused me to be the talk of all the people there. When everyone believed you had a particular liking for me, you without reason scarcely spoke to me. And now, my lord, I am the jest of the dirt and refuse of the theater. The impudent Miss Coax dared to make a boast that you would not leave talking to them to notice me. Allow me to say, my lord, you ought on Saturday night to have come to me from them and spoke to me and not notice me in the distant manner you did. It was a duty I consider you owe me when you recollect all circumstances. I am sure you will think as I do. I have been an ass, a fool. Oh, would I could go back the last 6 months. I am almost broken-hearted. I have hoped a vast deal from you because I knew you were unhappy, but I had a thing said to me on Saturday night that makes me resolve to say all I have to say and make a change in 1 or 2 things. You have not behaved towards me as I deserved, my lord, and you profess to feel towards me. I cannot, will not, bear this state of misery. Let me know what your feelings really are towards me and your intentions. God bless you. I could love you, but you will not let me, I fear. The second letter, scribbled in pencil, is dated 1816, but both letters refer to the events of autumn and winter 1815, when Byron's theatrical interests were at their height. My lord, it is very evident from the rudeness of your answer and manner last night, when I asked you how you were, and indeed from the whole of your behavior lately, that my attention to you is very offensive. I will never in future, my lord, so offend. I have waited frequently, which was the case last night, to say how do you do, but in future I shall spare myself mortification. Good God, what could Diblin think? No matter, you intended to wound the feelings of one who never thought or behaved otherwise than honestly to you, and if 'twill give you any satisfaction to know that you did wound me in my tenderness part, rest satisfied, for you did indeed. At home, Byron spoke freely of his escapades, but patiently made little difference to Byron's plans. Okay. On January 16th, Annabella informed Miss Lee that she had made the most explicit statement to her parents and that nothing could exceed their tender anxiety to do everything for the sufferer. They would invite him to make an indefinite stay at Kirby. He was to be treated as an invalid. Naturally, Annabella wrote her mother was deeply affected, but she was nonetheless quite composed. So he had lately become addicted to laudanum drinking, and Lady Knoll had suggested that rather than take the bottle away, Miss Lee should dilute its contents with 3/4 water, which won't make any observable difference. could she not persuade him to take his pills? So Annabella, his wife's reaction to finding out that he had fucked his sister was to, I guess the only way she could justify it was to think that he was crazy. So she felt that he needed medical treatment, and they had a doctor around him at all times. And then she had this really sympathetic way of looking at him like he was a crazy person. So his whole life is about to fall apart once Annabella is tired of his dumb ass and takes the kid and gets the fuck out of there. In stiff and forbidding sentences, it announced that Lady Byron's parents could not feel justified in permitting her return. They wouldn't let her go home. He knew that he was ill-suited to the married state, but then his emotionalism had a way of reconciling the most contradictory ideas. There was the reality of marriage, and there was the dream. There were the long months of irritation, gloom, and embarrassment, and there was the vision of marriage, of quiet, well-being, and domestic harmony that had so often floated before him as the goal that he sought. Demon he might be, but his feelings were human and sensitive. Yeah, right. Try and find some sympathy. He knew what she had suffered and would have sacrificed to avoid this extremity. But after seriously and dispassionately reviewing the misery that she had experienced almost without interval from the day of her marriage, she had finally determined on the measure of separation. It was unhappily her husband's disposition, she concluded, with an insight that must have wounded him more deeply than many pages of moral reproof. This is great. So this is the sentence that she fucking ends the marriage with and tells him, and you have to admit, I think she's heroic for standing up to him and saying this. So this is what she says to him when it's over. She tells him to consider what you have as worthless, what you have lost as invaluable. But remember that you declared yourself most miserable when I was yours. The guy just acted like being married was the most miserable condemnation that anybody could ever suffer. And she paid the price for it. It can be fully and clearly proved that I left your house under the persuasion of your having a complaint of so dangerous a nature that any agitation might bring a fatal crisis. Yeah, he threatened to kill himself. She saw him alone, blah-de-de-blah. It will be noticed that although Annabella denied that she and her friends were responsible for the reports reflecting on Mrs. Lee's character, the rumors that got out that he fucked his sister, that's what we're talking about. Annabella's saying that she wasn't responsible for it, but she was responsible, and her friends and her mother helped her. She did not pause to discuss their authenticity, and on March 4th, wishing to do all that she could to mitigate the discomforts of Miss Lee's position, but at the same time reluctant to abandon an advantage that might stand her in good stead, were Byron to carry out his threat of removing his child and handing her over to Augusta's guardianship. Okay, well, you get the gist. Byron agreed in writing that a deed of separation should be prepared. Its terms were still a matter of dispute, and in the meantime the lawyers haggled over the details of their separation. The hero of the tragedy had been caught up in one of those small, pathetic, poignant, and yet ridiculous dramas that at almost every stage formed the background of his adult life. Even now, there were women to write him letters. And one of those, this woman, where's her name? She starts writing him letters. Yeah, Clara. She felt, well, her sister had gone with the poet Shelley, and she felt that she was like a groupie. She was a bohemian, free love-minded woman, and she, in the midst of Byron's life is over, nobody wants to talk to him. His wife leaves him. All the newspapers, all the gossip of London society, everybody knows he fucked his sister. And then this girl Clara is writing him letters, and she turns up at his house, and the book says he reluctantly has sex with her. I don't know who reluctantly has sex with anybody. But it's interesting that even when he's branded a lecherous scumbag, that there were still women that wanted to have sex with him. And Clara is going to be the link to Mary Shelley and the poet Shelley that we're going to talk about when we talk about Byron in Switzerland and Italy in the next episode. But she turns up right as everything's falling apart. The whole world seemed to be collapsing about his ears. The dreams of Napoleonic grandeur had evaporated. And it is curious to read in an unpublished note. And a moment came towards the end of March when he hesitated to pay any further visits to the theater, under the apprehension that he might be hissed. Yeah, the guy doesn't like scenes. So he can't go to the theater. People are going to boo him and hiss him. Byron, Whig, that's the party of the liberals, and reputed atheists could expect no quarter, no sympathy. At last the Tory press had its revenge. Fame so extensive carries within itself the seeds of future detestation. And though Byron had delighted his countrymen, the envy he had aroused was of the kind that is never far removed from hatred. He had puzzled England, and the English are not a race who enjoy the sensation of being puzzled for very long. All right, well, this is the end. Hobhouse set out first with Polidori. Polidori was his young doctor who he hired to go with him. So he's got his party. He had a carriage made identically to the one that Napoleon drove around. He's got lots of money. His life in England is over, and he's getting the fuck out of there. And he hired his own doctor. Scrope Davies, his buddy, followed in the poet's new Napoleonic carriage, built for him by Baxter, the coachmaker, at a cost of some £500. Okay, so this is the end. This is the very last paragraph of the Peter Quennell book on Byron Years of Fame. Every eye followed him, a small, compact figure. Oh, yeah, this is when he goes to the... he's at the... he's going to sail out of there. He's at Dover, yeah. And, like, women dressed up as servants to go out and look at him. Every eye followed him, a small, compact figure, dignified, disdainful, his chestnut curls, which escaped from beneath the peak of his ornate traveling cap, already lightly touched with the threads of gray. The excitement of departure kept him in spirits, but he looked affected when the hawsers, Hawsers, had been loosened and the packet began to glide out towards the waters of the open channel. Hobhouse ran to the end of the wooden pier, and as the vessel tossed by us through a rough sea and a contrary wind, I saw him again. The dear fellow pulled off his cap and waved it to me. I gazed until I could not distinguish him any longer. God bless him for a gallant spirit and a kind one. Okay, now he's sailing away from England, never to return. And I know this was a long episode, and it was a lot of highlights to read, but this continues the fascinating story of Lord Byron. And part 3, we will discuss his years of exile in Italy and his death in Greece. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this, and try not to fuck your sister, everybody, and stay away from opium. Okay, yeah, whatever. Shalom, amigos y amigas. Long may you slide your clubfoot.
Tom Rhodes, you're a funny man. Tom Rhodes, you're an international comedian. Tom Rhodes, body kick, baby, oh yeah. Tom Rhodes, you're a groovy dude. You go all around the world, telling jokes to all of the people. You are an international comedian. You're funny to everybody in every single country in the world. Tom Rhodes, I like you very much. I think you're talented and very wonderful. Tom Rhodes, you're the best guy in the world. I wanna be your friend, you should call me sometime. Here is my phone number, 603-644-0048. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tom Rhodes, you're an international comedic sensation. Tom Rhodes, I like to listen to your podcast. Tom Rhodes, you're the best man to ever walk on the earth.